In the last tutorial, we made a distinction between economic development and economic growth. We defined economic development as an improvement in the economy's ability to contribute to people's well-being. We defined economic growth as an increase in the amount of marketed goods and services produced in the economy, measured using GDP. Today we'll look at ways in which economic growth does and does not contribute to people's well-being. We'll do this by focusing on the concept of justice. Earlier, we had looked at several different standards or understandings of justice. Today we'll use a broader definition. Justice means that everyone has access to what they need to live a good life. And you'll notice that this can be interpreted according to any of the standards of equity or justice that we looked at previously. So our question is, to what extent does economic growth help ensure that everyone has access to what they need to live a good life? Obviously, we need some marketed goods and services, such as food, clothing, shelter, and other material necessities, in order to live a good life. So on this graph, each dot represents a country. The vertical axis measures life expectancy. The horizontal axis measures GDP per capita. We can see that in many countries, particularly in Africa and South Asia, GDP per capita is very low, less than $10,000 a year. These countries also have life expectancies that are far below those in the richer countries. In the Central African Republic, for example, GDP per capita is only $600 a year, and people only live for 50 years on average. So in countries like this, economic growth is desperately needed in order to help people live good lives. However, economic growth statistics don't capture all of the things that influence well-being. In this graph, the vertical axis measures people's self-reported life satisfaction. So people were asked to say how happy they were with their lives right now on a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 is the best. The dot represents average life satisfaction in each country. The horizontal axis still measures GDP per capita. So you can see that at low levels of GDP per capita, there's a pretty strong correlation between GDP and life satisfaction. So life satisfaction increases rapidly as GDP per capita increases. But at somewhat higher levels of GDP, the relationship is more complicated, and in particular, you'll notice that it levels off quite a bit. So life satisfaction doesn't get much above 7, no matter how high a country's GDP is. And lots of countries with sort of middle of the road levels of GDP per capita still have very high life satisfaction. One of the reasons for the weak correlation between GDP and life satisfaction is that GDP misses some things that help people live good lives. GDP does not include goods and services that are produced within the household or community, unless those goods and services are sold in the market. So vegetables grown in a backyard garden, meals cooked for a family, care for seniors or children that happens within the family are not counted in GDP. But obviously, all of these things contribute to people's well-being. GDP also does not include the value of volunteer work. So that would be things like the contribution somebody might make to a community league, or meals that a person volunteers to provide through a homeless shelter, or any other type of unpaid work. GDP also doesn't include time that people spend in leisure, which also contributes to well-being. So one of the issues with focusing on economic growth and GDP is that increases in economic growth can actually come at the cost of all these other things which GDP doesn't measure. So if a family starts working more in order to earn more money, this leaves them with less time to care for their children and elderly relatives, less time to volunteer for worthy causes, and less time just to relax and have fun. So GDP will increase to reflect the increased working time, but it will not decrease to account for these other losses. Another issue is that GDP actually counts some things that make it harder for people to live good lives. So for example, it includes expenditures on goods and services that actually decrease well-being. Examples of these would be things like cigarettes, unhealthy foods, weapons, and pornography. Those things might increase the well-being of the person who buys them, at least for the moment, but many people believe that our societies would be better off overall if these things were not sold. Of course, the question of whether any specific good or service increases or decreases well-being is a hot topic for debate. GDP also includes defensive expenditures. These are expenditures that are made solely to defend us against harmful events that happen as the result of economic activities that are counted in GDP. So an example of this would be spending money to treat somebody for lung cancer, which they get as the result of smoking cigarettes. So GDP in this case would actually go up twice. First, it would go up because of the cigarette sales, and then it would go up because of the cost of treating the lung cancer. Now, obviously, we do want to treat people who have cancer, but it would have been better if the person hadn't gotten lung cancer in the first place. So the increase in GDP is not actually an accurate reflection of the change in well-being. Another example of a defensive expenditure would be spending more money on security systems as a result of more people having guns. It would probably be better for all of us if our society was safer in the first place, so that neither guns nor security systems would be necessary. GDP also includes expenditures on goods and services that are produced in a way that harms the well-being of the people who produce them. So for example, this might include clothes produced in a sweatshop where people are mistreated. It might include minerals produced in mines that are unsafe to work in. So the people who buy the clothes or the minerals are better off, but the workers are worse off, or at least worse off than they could be if they were treated fairly. Again, it's a matter of debate over whether society as a whole is better or worse off as the result of things like sweatshops. But the problem with GDP is that it only counts the positive effects and ignores the negative effects completely. GDP also ignores some other aspects of life that influence well-being. So for example, we generally tend to think that things like education, health, trust within a society, political participation, and so on tend to contribute to well-being. All else equal, a society with higher levels of human or social capital, for example, higher levels of education or political engagement, tends to be a better place to live. But GDP doesn't have a good way of taking these things into account. It only counts a human and social capital if people actually spend money on them. And some of that does happen, but lots of human and social capital formation happens outside of the market. GDP also doesn't account for natural capital, but we'll talk about that in the next tutorial. Sometimes an increase in GDP is financed through debt rather than people spending money that they already have. In this case, the contribution to well-being is debatable because debt has to be paid back. So even though well-being increases at the moment, in the long run it can have much more painful effects as people have to undertake painful decreases in consumption in order to pay back their loans as well as the interest. GDP also doesn't account for income inequality or any other types of inequality because it just measures the total amount of goods and services and doesn't look at who gets them. So all else being equal, many people believe that a more equal society probably has more well-being than a very unequal society. GDP simply has no way to take this into account. And in fact, economic growth can sometimes increase inequality. So we'll look in the next part of the tutorial at two specific ways in which this can happen, through international trade and through the effects of economic growth on Indigenous peoples.